Hello everyone. Friends and colleagues, welcome to the Melbourne School of Design. My name is Sarah Brocklesby and I'm the Manager of Engagement and Partnerships here. I begin this evening's proceedings by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people, the traditional owners of the land on which the Parkville campus stands. I pay my respects to elders, past and present, and any Indigenous guests here tonight. You are very welcome. We acknowledge and respect that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people had and still have laws that predate colonisation. We share in their responsibility to care for country as built environment and design experts, and thank our traditional custodians for sharing their knowledge. We're so pleased to welcome you all here tonight for this exploration of the exhibition New Horizons, From Darkness Comes Light. I would like to thank Theo Blankley, Warren Anderson, Professor Alan Pert and Professor Philip Goad for their incredible work delivering this program and exhibition. I would also like to thank the Australian Centre for Architectural History and Urban and Cultural Heritage for their support of this exhibition. New Horizons presents the beginnings of an ongoing survey into the migration of some well-known and some lesser-known designers and practitioners, and the deeply influential place they cemented in the burgeoning art and design landscape of Australia in the 1940s, 50s and 60s. By showcasing the Perth-based Émigrés Ivan Ivanov alongside a collective chorus of artists, designers, architects and creatives of European origin and education who practiced in Melbourne, we hope to contribute to the redress and revival of their careers. Through great duress and loss often came new horizons and prolific legacies. This exhibition is part of an ongoing survey by the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning into the role, impact and influence Émigrés creatives have had on Australia's design landscape. The exhibition closes this coming Monday, 3rd of April, so if you haven't had a chance to visit, I'd encourage you to do so. Tonight we welcome Professor Alan Pert, Professor Philip Goad and Professor Harriet Edquist for a conversation about Émigrés, the designed interior and the extraordinarily rich, creative and collaborative landscape present in Victoria after migration. Philip Goad is internationally known for his research and is an authority on modern Australian architecture. Philip has worked extensively as an architect, conservation consultant and curator. Philip is an expert on the life and work of Robin Boyd and has held visiting scholar positions at Columbia University, Bartlett School of Architecture in London and UCLA Los Angeles. Philip is a past editor of Fabrications, the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, Australia and New Zealand, and is a contributing editor of Architecture Australia. Along with Professor Julie Willis, he's the editor of the Encyclopedia of Australian Architecture. Alan Pert was appointed Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning in 2021. He previously served as the Faculty Director of Melbourne School of Design from October 2012. Alan is the faculty lead for the university's new campus at Fisherman's Bend, due to open in 2027. His appointments at the University of Melbourne followed 6 years as Professor of Architecture and Director of Research at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, Scotland. Alan is also an acclaimed architect. As Director of Northern Office for Research by Design, Alan aims to carry out practice-based research, analysing and forging propositions across writing, discourse, exhibitions, education and building. NORD was established to allow the practice of architecture and research to coexist. It is through the practice of architecture and design that NORD undertakes its research, often by using competitions and live projects as vehicles to develop and test ideas. Harriet Edquist, who's joining us online, was the founding director of the RMIT Design Archives and founding editor of RMIT Design Archives Journal. Now Professor Emerita of RMIT, Harriet's work as historian, editor, commentator, curator and archivist has animated architectural, design and exhibition scholarship for decades. Harriet has published widely and created numerous exhibitions in the field of Australian architecture, art and design theory. I'd like to now hand over to Alan, who will chair tonight's discussion. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. Welcome, everyone. Now, this is going to be quite an informal session. It really is supposed to be a conversation, and Harriet is there, hiding behind New Horizons. She is online listening. But I thought I'd maybe kick off with some slides, which might provoke a conversation. So this is not scripted. Philip has not looked at the slides. Harriet's not seen the slides. But we thought it might be a good opportunity just to reflect on some of the work we have been doing over the last few years and provoke some thoughts about potentially future research. Now, as Sarah mentioned, it's part of an ongoing exhibition that is in the Dulux Gallery. I'm sure most of you have probably seen it. And I have to say a big thank you to Theo Blankley as well for helping to curate that and manage in such a short space of time. Importantly, the exhibition's in two parts. So one part of the exhibition is focused on Ivanov. The second part of the exhibition really builds on research that we've been doing, and a lot of it through critical and curatorial practices in design, which is a subject that Philip and I have been running now for a number of years. I think we started it back in 2014. And Harriet's been a big supporter of the subject, so it's great to get the three of us together to talk and reflect on some of that work. Now, it's also important to note that the Émigrés story is part of a very long and important history of research, interests in archival practices, of teaching and learning initiatives, importantly work that speaks to a number of important collections housed not only here at the University of Melbourne, but across the city through important and complementary collections housed at RMIT Design Archives, the State Library Victoria, the beautiful new Melbourne Holocaust Museum, the Jewish Museum, Dulwich Studio, and the National Gallery of Victoria. It's also important to recognise that Philip and Harriet, amongst others like Hannah Louie, David Nichols, Andrew Saniga, Catherine Townsend, and more recently Ariel Hoffman, have all published widely on the Émigrés story. And along with Harriet, they have collectively laid the foundation for what we now see as a substantial body of work that explains how a group of exiles cast their influence across the entire sphere of Antipodean artistic practice in the built environment in the post-war period. We've also seen the publication of other important sources over recent years, and we will still rely heavily on personal stories which are captured in important books like From Strauss to Matilda, which includes very personal reflections by people like Naomi Fuchs. Now I'm going to start with my own personal interest after moving into the Fuchs house back in 2013. But in 2016, as part of critical and curatorial practices, we took full advantage of the house and of the archives. Now importantly, the archives were split across 5 institutions. So we took the opportunity as part of critical and curatorial practice 2016 to bring the archives back into the house. So the house became both museum, an exhibition and repository of information. It was an opportunity for the students and for myself and Philip to really synthesise the archives and try and understand the full portfolio of work by Ernest Fuchs. At that point in time, we catalogued with the students 393 buildings by Fuchs in the southeast suburbs, and it continues to grow as we still find more buildings. Only 2 are heritage listed. Now, we talked about this as a modernist detour, and I want to come back to this at the very end of the presentation. Importantly, we described Fuchs's work from the inside out, and this directly relates to the archival practice of looking quite forensically at all the drawings of his domestic work. And what we discovered through that process was that Fuchs worked from the nucleus of the house, from the inside out. So he would start with an interior sketch, typically like this, one of 32 Howett Road. He would work with people's collections, with their books, with their artefacts, and with their artwork. He would sketch it out in detail, and then he'd work his way back out the house. Some might argue that the architecture was quite ambivalent to the interior. The interior is where the richness of his work starts to unfold. We might start to ask some questions about what influenced Fuchs's interiors, the layout of the property. We even start to look at some of the floor surfaces. And Fuchs described the terrazzo as his civic space. So he didn't describe it as a house, he described it as a civic space for a multitude of functions. If we think about that detail there, after 2 years of living in the house, where we finally uncovered the drawings, 85 of them, of the house, we found a detail that revealed a silver screen that would fold down from that pelmet, and that room would turn into his lecture theatre. He also described it as a museum and a gallery, and a place to get married. So I've met people that have got married in the house. And we'll come back to this. So he moulds all sorts of typologies into the domestic sphere. One of the other opportunities we had was to return Fuchs's books back to the shelves. They were all boxed in 2013 after Naomi passed away, to be discarded, and fortunately we managed to retrieve the books and put them back on their shelves. And what we start to uncover through that is the footnotes to the practice. So I think this is really important. What you find on the shelves of the architectural office is the same magazines, the same periodicals, the same books as every other practice, but what you find in the personal bookshelves are the footnotes, and actually the real rich material that starts to shape, I think, his thinking. So we find a collection of Lewis Mumford books, which are significant because Mumford invites him to America in 1947. We find a full collection of Bernard Radowski, and he lectures about Radowski and refers to him as his friend and colleague. And we find Ernest Fuchs' X-Ray the City from 1946, his own book, which he was deeply proud of, and he sent it all over the world. Now, the collection by Radowski is something that needs further work. Philip's written about this, and we feel there's an opportunity to really unpick the influence of Radowski on Fuchs's work. Radowski left Vienna and went to America, became renowned for his exhibition design. But it was about 2 or 3 years after living in the house that I finally picked up behind the picture window, and after reading 2 chapters suddenly realised that the house was a physical manifestation of the book. Specifically, Fuchs relates to this idea of the ballast of the house, where Radowski talks about storage. And Fuchs talks about the ballast of the city, where he talks about what the city requires to shape itself. So they're a really important book. And Fuchs goes on to write in Home Beautiful magazine and various other places about the importance of storage in a domestic sphere. And it's an incredible set of drawings to talk about storage in that house. 21 pieces of fixed furniture that shape the space. So it's not a series of dividing walls, it's 21 pieces of furniture that actually subdivide the space. We also find books like this one. And the significance of this is it came with him from Vienna. So this is a book he packed. He felt it was so important. So Fuchs fled to Oslo, pretending to be going on a skiing trip, and he brought some of his books with him. And you can see it's all underlined. This is him thinking out loud. So the books are an incredible repository of what he's thinking, and what he's thinking about, not just cities, but what he's thinking about domestic space. There's 5 Fuchs scrapbooks that we retrieved and included in the exhibition in 2016. And in one of them, this handwritten list by Naomi Fuchs. And this is the repository that was gifted to the Baillieu Library here at Melbourne University. And as part of this, the kind of impact of the subject, we've painstakingly gone through the Baillieu and tried to retrieve these and create a special collection downstairs in the ABP Library. So we start to see this incredible repository of knowledge. And importantly, this was all about to disappear into a skip. There's also a collection of books by Claude Levi-Strauss, where we start to get an insight into his theoretical thinking. And Philip and I wrote a paper for Sahans back in 2017 where we started to talk about this idea of the brick allure. So again, he'd underlined throughout that book this idea of who the brick allure might be in the context of architecture. And you start to piece that together with Architecture Without Architects for Rudowski, and then we start to understand it in X-Ray the City in terms of what it means at a city context. And so, an important parallel is maybe to consider Boyd. And I don't know if, I'm sure people in the room have seen this before, but the 15-year-old that wrote to Boyd, criticising his fishbowl, describing it as featureism, and suggesting that Boyd was somehow contradicting himself. And Boyd wrote back to him and described this idea of a singular idea. So I look mainly for an idea that is one main idea per building instead of the more usual assortment of little ideas which are shaken up together to make a building. In complete contrast, if we look at Fuchs, it's an architecture of recycling, of quoting, of borrowing, of collage, of montage, synthesizing, mixing and recontextualizing. The house is exhibition with its architectural fragments and its archives and its artifacts, its objects and its books, with underlined and marked passages, dog-eared passages, becomes a kind of autobiographical debris which he successfully glued together as architecture. And I think this is one of the genius of Fuchs. If you were to describe the house to a lot of people that have not been there, it sounds like a mishmash of stuff. There's a bit of Japan, there's a bit of Alvar Aalto in Scandinavia, there's a bit of European modernism in the plan, there's some real craft work in the furniture, but the synthesis of this is, I think, where the genius lies. And it's a hard thing to communicate in a drawing. It's so layered and complex. Importantly, and I'll come back to this, it's very theatrical. Now, some of the other things we looked at was, as I said before, he sent his book to everybody. There was a great letter in the archive from Gropius acknowledging the book, but pretty much dismissing it. But Lewis Mumford invites him to America. So Fuchs's first trip out of Australia, after he arrived in 1938, is a trip to New York for the American Society of Planning Officials, their annual conference. And there he is there. And in the archives, he proudly circled himself with a biro, and there's Mumford on the top table. The only Australian at the conference. Now, a really important thing just to point out here is that Fuchs was working in Heath's office up until this point. So in 1946, he writes his first paper, The Democratic City in Australia, and then he publishes X-Ray the City shortly afterwards. He was put forward by Heath to be the director of the urban design office and rejected because of his alien status. So on this trip, he's obviously decided that he's not going back into Heath's office. He was so angry at the situation he found himself in. And what happens when he returns is he goes into private practice. So there's a really important 10-year period where Fuchs returns from America and goes into private practice. And then he goes off on a world tour in the tail end of 1957, which really then transforms and reshapes his practice. So I think there's periods, he goes to West Coast America here, travels around West Coast America, and you can see the influence of that in that first 10 years of practice when he's down in St Kilda. The other important thing to note is in 1947, Mumford writes in the New York Times a critique of international modernism, so the international style. So he goes into battle with Gropius and others, very critical of what's going on. And there becomes an open series of letters in the New York Times around this. So it's interesting to note that Mumford here is criticising modernism, as we have all known it for over 100 years. And he talks about, Mumford's talking about the lack of ecology and the lack of sensitivity for human beings. And it's interesting that there we are, we've got Fuchs over there, an invitation from Mumford. So there's something really significant, I think, in what Mumford sees in X-Ray the City. So I think it's a really important point to reflect on what happens in 1932 with the exhibition at MoMA. We know that Frank Lloyd Wright was included in the exhibition. but he wasn't included in the catalogue. And again, there's letters between Frank Lloyd Wright and Philip Johnson, with Frank Lloyd Wright arguing with Johnson over his omission in the catalogue. So again, there's something interesting to note there, and again, another piece of research it would be good to understand is why was Frank Lloyd Wright included in the exhibition? I think it's fair to say it was probably there as a point of difference. Something different to what Philip Johnson and Hitchcock were promoting as modernism. Now, I'm going to jump forward a bit. In 2018, Critical and Curatorial Practice in Design decided to expand on Fuchs, but to really close in on not just the domestic single houses, but in Fuchs's apartments, but we extended that to look at also pauper, Tisha, and Benchamesh. And here we go, here's Fuchs doing a drawing of an interior of an apartment complex, and look at the detail in it. Look at the bedroom, and I'm sure anyone that knows the work of Adolf Loos might see similarities in the way he's looking at the bedroom there, in terms of the carpeting and the walls. But the level of detail that he's looking at in the apartment, I think, is significant. So we studied Ernest Fuchs's apartments, we looked at Herbert Tischer's apartments, particularly Toorak Towers and Arong Towers. We looked at Kurt Popper's work and the spatial complexity of all of these plans. And there's something to be learned from that. And this is an ongoing piece of work that Philip and I are pursuing, and we hope to produce a publication in the next couple of years which captures a kind of atlas of apartment living, six-packs, walk-ups, particularly around the southeast suburbs. So the whole history of apartment living and the evolution of apartment living in the southeast suburbs, I think, is significant, particularly when we look at interior standards now. We also looked at Benchamesh in that context. And then we took an exhibition to Glen Ira Gallery, looking not only at the archives, but also looking at furniture design. So really mining interiors. In 2019, we then looked at 42 houses in Kew, through the lens of the endangered species in the Museum of Disappearing Buildings. So this looked through the heritage lens. It looked at the significance of the facade retention in Kew, which is deeply problematic when you consider the importance of the interior. So a number of houses in Kew where the facade's been retained, the interior has been lost. And I think this shows a kind of blind spot in what we're looking at in the context of heritage and the significance of the interior to some of these houses. So what we did in this context is we compared Caulfield and Kew, and if you look at the plethora, not just Émigrés, but Anglo-Australian architects, we asked students to take two houses, one by an Émigré, one by an Anglo-Australian, and compare and contrast them. In 2020, we then looked at Austria to Antipodes. So we suddenly realised there was a huge opportunity here to take this story back to Vienna. So really important to look at the legacy of the work, but to look at the opportunity here of exiles and to transfer their work back to Vienna. And where this starts really is in the NGV collection. When we consider two of the most significant interiors that came out of Vienna around that time was the Joseph Hoffmann Galley apartment and the Adolf Loos Langer apartment. Now what's significant here is Langer and Hoffmann and Loos went to school together. They fell out quite significantly. Anyone that's read anything, there was quite a vociferous relationship. Hoffmann went on to create the Viennese secession movement, create the secession building. Loos wrote to Hoffmann pleading to get one of the spaces to fit out, and Hoffmann rejected him. So amazing to think that those two interiors, two childhood friends who became two of the most contentious battleground of modernism, I think, that came out of Vienna, that two of their interiors would end up in Melbourne, in the NGV. So the Hoffmann apartment is fascinating. Hoffmann designed 5 rooms for the family: the hall, the salon, the smoking room, the dining room, the boudoir. It was a combination of furniture, both built-in and freestanding. But not only that, it extended to the floor coverings, to the wall coverings, to the light fittings, to the woodwork and plasterwork. In contrast, Luce designed an apartment within the Otto Wagner apartment block, and it comprised of a sideboard which fitted into the panelling. There was a room divider, a dining and drawing room chairs, a desk and chair, a wardrobe and bedroom chairs and cupboards. But importantly, for anyone again that's read Adolf Luce's work, and again there was a collection of books in the Fuchs house, he had just returned from a trip to England, which had a deep influence on his idea of the interior, and he included furniture that was not designed by him. So he embraced this notion of the ad hoc, and not a fully designed interior, the same way Hoffman was promoting. And so the big project that we're looking towards is returning 37 émigrés that we've explored through the subject and bringing them back to Vienna over the next few years. So this will really consolidate all of the work over a prolonged period. So Austria to Antipodes will look at digitally scanning those interiors in the NGV collection and taking them back. So not physically taking them back, but digitally taking them back, along with 37 other émigrés and their work. We'll include in that Harry Seidler, who's a 17-year-old walking through the streets of Vienna, saw the Hochhaus, a building produced by Thyssen Jacks that Fuchs worked on, that Radowski worked on, and in a similar way to maybe how Frank Lloyd Wright was included in the international style as a point of difference, Harry Seidler might be included as a point of difference. We'll take the archives back. It's an opportunity to really mine these interior drawings. So these are interior drawings by Fuchs that have formed some of the archival information for students over the years, and an incredible catalogue of interior drawings that shows Fuchs not just as an architect, but as a furniture designer. And that's something I want to come back onto. Very often we hear of Krimper, we hear of Rosando, we hear of Zuref, all being credited with the furniture design. But I think the drawings evidence that Fuchs was also a designer of furniture. And a very particular project, which will form part of an exhibition later this year in October, is 7 Lempriere Avenue, which is a great example of the consolidation of talent in one space. This is a modest extension to a house in East St Kilda. The client was George Smorgon, architect Ernest Fuchs, sculptural wall relief by Duldig, which was meant to be full height, and he fell out with Fuchs because it got chopped. But the wall relief by Karl Duldig, the furniture by Schulin Krimper, but there's a question mark. So if we look at the sofa and then remove it, looking through the archives, these are easy chairs that Fuchs designed. So we found the drawings of these. So maybe Krimper made them, but maybe Fuchs designed them. We don't quite know the authorship. So there's a really important lesson in fully mining the archives for information. And then photography by Wolfgang Sievers. So quite an incredible, modest extension to the house, yet what a plethora of talent that comes together. And so, the exhibition in 2020, we were in lockdown. We created a virtual exhibition in the Viennese Secession building, and we're currently in discussion with them about taking Austria to Antipodes as a longer-term physical project. Now, I want to just return quickly to the international style. So, in going through the Fuchs archives, the name Frederick or F. Keisler cropped up a few times. And it was only recently that I was reading back through the catalogue for the international style, and here it pops up again. And so he's referenced here as the magnificent factories of Albert Kahn in Detroit, like the Starrett Lee building in New York, are an exception. And then he goes on to say, Frederick Keisler and Richard Neutra are the best among the foreign-born, foreign-trained modern architects now practicing in America. The Keisler arrives in New York in 1926. He came out for an exhibition of theatre design. and never left. He didn't go back. So this exhibition was featuring some of his set designs. Fuchs refers to him as a theatre designer, a set designer. This is probably his most famous project, the Endless House. And I'm sure a lot of people are probably wondering why was that, have that anything to do with Fuchs? This was a 30-year project, exhibited at MoMA only recently. But it's a project that started in Vienna in the early 1920s, the idea of the Endless House, and it carried right throughout his career. He also produced this drawing in the top right in 1922, described as Vienna as the endless interior. And then he was invited with an issue of Progressive Architecture to write about his experience of Vienna, and he redrew it. Now, it's really important, this, I think, to understand, reflecting back on the house. His city of interiors located in the heart of public spaces, a complex weave of the drawing links cave to cave in a web, as if the visible city is but the cover for a single vast interior. So he describes Vienna as a series of interior spaces, not public spaces, but interiority. So if we continue to think about that, he then goes on to say, to map these interiors is to map the intellectual life of the city. So he talks about the Imperial Hotel, and this is where Karl Kraus, the most feared satirist and critic, and with him a group of other intellectuals gathered daily. So he goes on to describe Adolf Loos, Koschka, Schulberg, Berg, von Webern, and then he goes on to talk about the Cafe Museum, and you're remembering the long table at the end of the room in front of the all-wall mirror, where after lunch and after dinner assembled the composers, Franz Lehrer, Oscar Strauss, and others. And then he talks about the museum cafe. So what you get a sense here is a picture of all these spaces that the social life of and intellectual life of the city that he describes as an interiority. Vienna as an endless interior. Importantly, if we go back to the early days of the 1920s, this is what he was more renowned for, his set design, or space stages as he called them, referred to as endless theatre. He was the first to really embrace technology, moving sets, the elimination of the proscenium arch, audience engagement in a particular way, projection and film. So just think about television at that point in time, the advent of television. So he's fully embracing technology in the context of theatre and production. And two brilliant images. So the photo collage, which is back in 1923. And importantly, I think, just to think about Fuchs in this context, Fuchs starts studying at the same school, technical school in Vienna, 1924. So Fuchs enters in 24, this is 1923. And then this is a drawing, the section of the Universal or Endless Theatre, which was on display in New York. So this is what took him to New York, was an exhibition of his drawings and models. What's also fascinating about Keisler is he worked for Adolf Loos, and he studied under Loos. So Loos refers to him in some of his archival work. And what's interesting, if we start to look at Adolf Loos's interiors, they appear sometimes like exteriors, windows to other rooms. So we get this constant layering of space. And if you think about the cross-section and the round plan, which we became famous for. So what Keisler learned from Loos was the idea of the house as a theatrical space in which the visitor is some kind of actor. And I think this is really important when we start to think about Fuchs. So the idea of the domestic space is a theatrical space. Now where this all comes together is in Hellerau. So this is where the origins of modern dance are referenced. Hellerau Theatre in Dresden, 1911. Adolphe Appia was working with Jacques Dalcroze and produced what was referred to as the white cube theatre. Not a black cube, but a white cube. No proscenium arch, and audience and actors would enter side on. It was a space designed around shadow movement. It's interesting to see the yin and yang. This became a Russian police station, and that was replaced by a Red Star in later years. But a really significant building that Fuchs claims, and Catherine Townsend's written about this, Fuchs went there after giving up in architecture after 2 years of education. So in 1928, Fuchs left architecture, went on a family holiday to Hellerau, and decided to go back to architecture. He was so moved by this building. Luce was there, Luce refers to it, Corbusier refers to it, they all refer to the impact of Hellerau on their careers. And so it was an incredible partnership between Adolphe Appia, who was a Swiss architect and theorist, Henrik Tessenhoff, who was a German architect and professor, and Jacques Delcroze, who was a Swiss composer. So a really significant building that transformed Fuchs's thinking. And here we find Fuchs in 1928-29. This is in our collection downstairs. So this photograph is a really important reference back to his interest in theatre, where he worked for Max Reinhardt. So if you look at his CV, he actually credits Max Reinhardt. And he also enrolled with Laban in a dance school. And these are costume designs that we have the originals downstairs in our archives. And I'm going to make a big leap here. But this is a clothing shop for kids in Melbourne. Sadly not there any longer, but by Fuchs. And I'm making a huge leap. But it's an interesting one. And it is described as a theatrical setting. But you do wonder, this is called the space stage, and this is also referred to as the space stage. So a shop interior that starts to cascade in terms of the displays. So we wonder about this notion of the theatre and the impact of what was going on in Vienna at that point in time. There's also a fantastic publication called Elastic Architecture, which covers Keisler's work. And again, it's another leap. But Philip and myself have written about the Growing House and the exhibition in Vienna in 1932. And we wonder if there is any correlation between this notion of an elastic architecture and notions of a growing house. So I want to return to Boyd for a second. And this idea of the pursuit of a singular idea, which arguably is something we can trace right through from 1932 in the international style. I would argue, some might argue against it, but I would argue that if you were ever trying to do a lecture with limited means, you could draw the cross-section of Wall Street and pretty much explain that house. In contrast, I couldn't do that with Fuchs. I wouldn't quite know which drawing to start with, because it's made up of fragments, multiple fragments. The Puri Library, that becomes a lecture room. Japan, that becomes a series of pergolas and outdoor rooms. Details, the plan, Los Angeles. There is a multitude of details, there's a multitude of plans, there's a section that's really important, there's a landscape that's really significant. It's a very difficult house to explain in one drawing. So I do think there's an important consideration when we look at some of these Émigrés interiors and Émigrés plans. And I think an important statement here is the constant in Keisler's architecture was pushing a new medium into an old one. So he was pushing film into theatre, he was pushing television into the shop window, the museum into the house, in order to update it and to literally expand its horizon. Fuchs called his own house, as I said before, a civic space. He called it a theatre, he called it a lecture room, and he also referred to it as an art gallery. And as I said before, it was a space to get married. He went on to talk about radio, music, its phonetic decoration. Again, a parallel with Keisler. And I'm going to leave it on this slide. But I do wonder if Svetlana Boym's reference to the off-modern is something we should be considering when we consider the Émigrés interior. This growing awareness of 20th century heritage has led to a review of the accepted architectural histories that dominate our understanding of the development of modern architecture in Australia, is something that Rebecca Hawcroft wrote in the foreword to her book. And so this idea of going off kilter, off Broadway, off the path, are way off brand, off the wall, and occasionally off colour. Off modern is a detour into the unexplored potentials of the modern project, and I think it's a worthy point to have a conversation. Yeah. And Philip's going to completely disagree with me now. Now, can we also welcome Harriet, who has been patiently listening online?
Hi.
Hi, Harriet. So, Harriet, I was going to ask you a question first, if I may, unless you want to start with anything in particular.
No.
So, I wanted to ask you, you've done an enormous amount of research about Viennese émigrés to Australia. And it's really pioneering work. And I wanted to ask you, when many of them arrived in Australia, the interior became an avenue for them to promote themselves, to show their expertise. What venue did they use to talk about interior, the idea of the interior in the late 1930s or 1940s?
Well, the sort of the easy answer to that is I'm not sure if yours is where you're leading, but in the stuff I've written, I argued that the Australian Home Beautiful, this is Melbourne, I'm not talking about Sydney, sort of is very interesting because it took it upon itself to publish scores of articles written by émigré architects and designers on the post-war house or on the modernist house, and that often was on the interior. So there was a lot of, they could publish in popular journals, and I think that's very important. They could publish books and stuff that architects read, but in the end, interiors are populated and inhabited by people who are quite ordinary. They're not, quite apart from what architects think, they're meant to be lived in. And so I think that the idea of reaching out to the public through women's magazines and popular magazines was very special. And I don't know if it's replicated anywhere else in the country, but it was quite, there's just article after article. Fuchs, all the people, they all wrote them. People we've lost, like Carl Hoffman, people whose careers really died when they came to Australia, but they did write a few things, so that through that publication regime, particularly the Australian Home Beautiful, which was absolutely great, until all the architects who were enlisted in the RAF came back. Is that what you mean? That's
yes,
one of
absolutely.
the areas that they
leading you
published
here.
in.
You've done exactly what I thought you would, so that's great.
And actually reading that stuff is great. And so, did you see, sorry, I'm just going off modern here,
Right.
you wouldn't have seen that, but there's an auction house in Tassie that all Tasmanians, look at. And they had a couple of boxes last year, or perhaps earlier this year, of Australian Home Beautifuls. And they had one of the 1920s and 30s that went for over $2,000.
That's a lot.
Oh.
Yeah. So the reason to ask about Home Beautiful is that these émigrés were writing not so much about buildings, but they were writing constantly about interiors.
Yeah,
so
they were.
furniture, wall finishes, how to actually, if you like, live in interior space.
Yep.
And I think what's marvellous about when you write about this, you make the suggestion that this in a way is presaging a lot of the more better known writings about interior design of the 1950s. So there's this, in a way, not prophecies that we're seeing in the émigrés writing about how to live in the post-war years, and it's coming through Central European émigrés, many from Vienna, but others from that part of Europe.
I mean, Fuchs is interesting here. I've forgotten the details now, but he does talk about the psychology of living in a house. It is about living. It's not about objects. It's about life.
Yeah.
And he gets that from Joseph Frank, and he gets it from Loos, because that's what Loos and Frank talk about.
Yeah. They
talk about life in the interior. And so there's a couple of Fuchs's articles, I think in 1940-41, where he is sort of tapping into that Viennese history of the way one lives, really,
and also
inhabits an interior.
Yes, and also to the way these émigré architects, particularly in Vienna, were trained. The idea of modern comes out of a tradition of craft, psychology, and human comfort.
Yeah.
Which is
Loos is really big on that, and he's got.
Absolutely.
As you know, I mean, his essays are just on and on about craft and craftsmanship and honesty and the tyranny of the upholsterer and the tyranny of the architect and the tyranny of Hoffman and so on. And he constantly comes back to this idea of inhabitation, and in the end, the person who is living in the house has to be able to change it. And the thing is that interiors can't be, I sort of take, one issue I do take with you, Alan, is that you can't mandate to save interiors, because the whole of the Loosian idea and his modernist idea, unlike Hoffman of the interior, is it changes all the time. Whoever is a new inhabitant changes the interior. That's what interiors do. They're constantly changing. You shift your table from one, part of the room to another. You shift the sofa from one room to another. It's always emerging the interior in a properly lived-in house. And if you sort of say, well, this is the interior, it's sort of like, I think it's not right. And it's sort of, in a way, denying that idea of the interior as a lived space. So interiors are really difficult. I mean, they just can't be, I don't think they can be
if we were a series of German modernists, we would talk about a Wohn machine, a living machine. Do you think the Austrians thought like that?
No.
No.
I don't think they did.
No.
Well, the ones that I'm talking about, that tradition that comes from Loos up through Frank, and then the people who worked in House and Garden in Vienna and that lot. I can't pronounce their names, and also my brain, I can't really remember them either. Sort of, you'll remember them, Philip. But no, they hated the Bauhaus. They thought it was fascist because it was just, it told you how to live. And they were saying, no, life is life. You have to live in a house. And also, houses are for families. There's children destroy things. Yes. Dogs are a menace. Sort of. So it's. I think we have to. The interior is really tricky, and I think. And Alan, you asked me to do this, and I was thinking, all right, I think we've probably got two propositions here. The one that Alan's put forward, which is really a proposition about design, which is perfectly, it's the proposition we always talk about. It's the architectural design proposition, and then I think there's another one that's coming through a whole range of thinkers, and is the proposition about inhabiting space, and they're very different.
And also, particularly with the émigré experience, of the furniture itself often being mobile. So people like Carl and Gertrude Langer in Brisbane brought their chairs and their dining setting from Vienna when they left Europe, and the Duldigs also.
The Duldigs did, but so did the Tandlers, and I think this is sort of. I'll I'll just go completely out on a limb here because it's sort of something I'm thinking about. I can't, and I'm hoping you're going to help because I can't quite work out how to deal with it. But yes, they did. But as I was saying to Alan yesterday when we were chatting about this talk, is that when they came out, their furniture was deracinated. It didn't belong. It was pulled up from its roots. So it's this furniture that's sort of wafting around, and it has to find a new home. So with Duldig, for example, Slava Duldig, the furniture she designed, that found a new home, but if you look at the rooms where it is, it's layered. It's layered with a huge Chinese cabinet that they bought from the McClellans, and it's layered with their Windsor chairs that they bought and their Turkey rugs that they bought in Melbourne. And in the end, it's about, this is how I personally think about interiors, it's about composing and arranging. And it's the interiors is an arrangement that sort of all of these different things, which all have different histories, and then they find this new home. So her home in East Melbourne is completely different from her home in the city of Vienna. It's nothing like that, and it's got these other layers of colonial sort of Singapore and Australia and so I think the Émigrés interior is completely different from the Viennese interior.
Sure.
Because you've got this other movement, this sediments layer and layering.
Sure. And I like the way Alan talked about using Harry Seidler as a counterpoint. When the Seidlers, their apartment in Vienna was designed by Fritz Reichel, very well-known interior designer, and Rose Seidler commissioned Fritz to do this fantastic interior. And then when Rose and Max Seidler commissioned Harry to do the house in Tarahumara, or Wahroonga, as we're supposed to say, what Harry refuses to do is let his mother have any of the Viennese cutlery on show, anything Viennese. So it's completely, he cancels Vienna from that Émigrés interior and replaces it with his own very beautifully coordinated interior. He's almost producing the Gesamtkunstwerk in the way.
And Rose didn't like that, and Rose stamped her tiny foot, and she said she was keeping the cutlery, and she was keeping something else, the whole canteen. There's one in the Langer house too, these huge canteens with all the cutlery in it. She wouldn't get rid of that. She wouldn't get rid of something else. And then Penelope said in an interview not so long ago that in their antiquity that she and Harry sort of brought out the canteen and they started using Rose's because of the memory. And that's what I was going to say. This is all about memory.
Yeah.
And you can't talk about these interiors if you don't talk about memory.
Sure.
One thing I'm curious about, just going back to this heritage issue, because I think Hugh's interesting in this context because there is a lot of facade retention. And if you look at the Heritage Act, there is this 4.6 metres back from the street. Do you want?
Yeah.
I've heard the comment.
This is a plan in terms of heritage and planning.
Yeah. And so if we think about the Fuchs interior, which I think issues of theatre and performance play out. So the screens absolutely are about how do we reveal. So there was a whole kind of ritual around entering the Fuchs house. You would be held in that lobby space with the screens closed, and you'd be given a drink and you would look at the artwork, and then he would open the screens and you would go into the living space. It was a whole sequence of theatrical moves, and I can see that in other interiors that he's done. And if that's the kind of core principle of his plan and his arrangement of space, then is the facade that important? Is the architect... So the Act at the moment, it really puts the emphasis on the architecture of the front street, when actually the nuance of it's in the interior.
But I think this is where the Fuchs house is different because it's on the Heritage Register, so the interior is protected. But this is, I think, part of our bigger project is to identify interiors that remain, and like the Smorgon interior, is celebrate that, because there are so few. And I agree, Harriet, that the idea of the interior generally, whether it's émigré or not, is essentially dynamic. And
but it always goes back to the grown house. I mean, there's another kind of paradox of heritage, because, again, if you look at quite a lot of Fuchs's plans, they're all designed to grow. There's an idea that you could add on, yet arguably they're frozen in time. So I think the idea of the grown house, suggests that, you know, they were thinking about the evolution of the home and the family.
The other interest for me is the émigrés came, they wrote in Home Beautiful, they had their communities which were largely interdisciplinary. So Fuchs knew Duldig, knew Krimper, they work across disciplines with consummate ease. I'm wondering, Harriet, in terms of the teaching of these new skills, certainly at University of Melbourne, some people in the audience might remember Fritz Geneba, who was Viennese, who was a very influential teacher here. At RMIT, were there influential émigrés across the various disciplines?
Yeah, there were, and I've been thinking about this because of the show that I've just curated on 1980s Melbourne, and of the designers who we're showing in that, and there's quite a lot of them. Pretty much all of them, that's not grammatical, anyway, came out of art schools in technical colleges. And the thing about tech colleges, and there's, if you think you've got RMIT, and then you've got this inner suburban ring. You've got Paran, Caulfield, Swinburne, all around the inner suburbs. You've got these technical colleges, and they teach applied art, and they teach design. And so students just move between them, and they've also got the equipment. So a student going into fine art, someone like Gavin Brown, who we show in the exhibition, he has no problem at all moving into textiles, designing textiles, and then going into fashion. So I reckon that in Vienna, when you've got the technical colleges, very much the same thing obtains. The thing is, the colleges teach all this stuff, and students take lessons with these various masters. So it's not a big stretch for them to think about the fact that they work. It's embedded in their teaching, in their education.
Move into an education.
I can't actually remember who went to the technical university and who went to Vienna University. I haven't got that in my brain, but
in Vienna, you had three schools essentially.
Vienna University, and that's where Langer went. Is that right?
But that was after you went to the Technische Hochschule, or you went to the Kunstgewerbeschule, or you went to the Academy of Applied Arts. Angewandte.
Same thing.
And same thing. And if you wanted to do a PhD, then you went to the University of Vienna.
Right.
So, and that didn't teach architecture. So in Vienna, at the very least, and it was the same in Breslau and the Bauhaus itself, it was this idea of applied art and the crossing of the disciplines constantly.
Well, I mean, Richard Handler was trained as a silversmith for his family, and then he went and did architecture. But there's images of him in craft classes and so forth. So I think it's exactly the same in Melbourne, in the technical colleges after the war. So if you train like that, and if you've got the equipment that everyone can, the equipment's really important. Studio equipment is absolutely essential for this. So if you've got a printing press, or you've got, cutting machines, or you've got whatever it is, anyone can use them. So and you remember what it was like over the photocopier in the 1980s, the new equipment. So if you've got all of these people, one might be an architect, one might be a textile designer, coming in and using the equipment, I think it's not surprising. It's built into the education system, I would think.
I want just to go back to, given Harriet's looked at Joseph Frank, I thought it'd be quite, so Joseph Frank was included in Weissenhof,
Yeah, he was.
but he was mocked, is that right?
No, they hated him. They couldn't bear his interiors. They had a complete fit.
Yes.
The exterior was all right, but the interiors had cushions and things like that, and
Floral
textiles
curtains
and pattern on it.
yeah, he had floral
He had
coverings
florals.
of
No, they
beds.
completely freaked out. Yeah,
So again, so he was the point of difference.
Correct.
Yeah.
totally, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is the 1927 Wiesenhof Siedlung exhibition. You have architects like Mies van der Rohe, Gropius, even Hans Scharoun,
Yep.
plus Joseph Frank, who's the outlier. He's the off-modern.
Yeah.
Yeah, he totally the off-modern, but incredibly successful.
It'd be interesting to consider the lineage now. If you thought if Joseph Frank was around today, would it be the IKEA? I wonder what.
He is around today because they still,
In Sweden, they still produce his
I've
fabrics.
got some. My curtains are Joseph Frank. They still produce his fabrics, which are fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so,
So,
I think
you know, he's survived, but also I think, you know, that idea that Lois had is something which I think is really interesting in terms of that, Alan, you started off with that, you know, the proposition of modernism and this, you know, the endless future trajectory of it. But what Lois says is that if you've got something that works, like a Chippendale chair, that's worked for 200 years, you don't have to change it. You can still use it, which is what he did. And so that to me is sort of, in a way, problematizing this idea of the avant-garde, because it's suggesting a circular history that, no, you can go back to the 18th century and get a really good design and just keep using it.
Yeah, it's completely the reverse, and that you, as I said before, that furniture can be mobile, passed down through generations, or it can cross continents and the like. But I like Alan's point, though, talking about that if you haven't seen it, that very beautiful series of Lois furniture where the sideboard is actually part of the wall.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's to me something utterly modern that Lois is interested in, where the wall becomes furniture and can become cladding at the same time. It becomes a sort of architecture surrounding your memory belongings at the same time.
So I've got a question for both of you, given your book, The Bauhaus Diaspora. If we consider what happened in North America, like Gropius, Mies, Moholy-Nagy, so the impact that they have in terms of the Bauhaus lineage going to North America and teaching, you think of the generations of architects that came through their schooling. And then arguably, Frank Lloyd Wright's pushed to the side in the North American schools at that point in time. And we think about the lineage of Bauhaus here. It's quite a frightening prospect to reflect on that and think that, you know, we've got generations that were promoting a very particular lineage from the Bauhaus. And what we're describing in some of this Émigrés interior and Joseph Frank is a completely different modernism. Have we got lots of work to do to try and unpick this?
Look, it's an interesting question, Alan, because many people say or suggest that when Fritz Geneba came here, he ran a Bauhaus curriculum. But if you look at it, certainly some of the preliminary studies, and Hugh O'Neill did them with us, I did watercolour and poster colour studies in colour contrast. But I think Geneba was always clear in that the progression that you made was to the interior, and Hugh O'Neill made us do that as well. I think it was there's not stuff, it's not lost in translation, but I think there's a modification
Yeah.
by those educators here. And the if you like, the objective nature of the Bauhaus teaching,
Yeah.
as we know it, it's complicated, but I think we do forget that the first 4 years of the Bauhaus were very much about colour, the craft, eurythmy, Johannesiten. It was very experimental, body-centred and the like, before it shifted into the sort of machine ideas that we associate with the Bauhaus.
Yeah.
It's complicated.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. And Australians are very pragmatic. They're not idealists. They're not going to, you know, bow down before the Bauhaus.
Right. I'm going to ask one last question of Alan. The endless house idea, you can take it many ways, I think. And it occurred to me when you showed the images of the Fuchs toy shop and the space stage,
Yeah.
that and the fact that Fuchs had all of these books by Radowski, do you think at some stage there was a nostalgia for the critical climate of Europe, or these émigrés were prepared to discover so-called, as Theo described in the title of the exhibition, New Horizons? How much do you think their practice would have been seen as disappointment at not being still in Europe, or new possibilities?
Wow.
It's speculation, but it's a speculation. But it's just a way. I mean, the exhibition has as its basis new horizons, new beginnings, and I wonder with someone like Fuchs how much he saw Australia as new territory. Certainly, the Italian Enrico Taglietti thought Canberra was going to be the new Brasilia.
Yeah, yeah. Look, I would struggle to. I mean, I think a lot of what we see in the early days is West Coast America. So if you look at that trip to America in 1947, and then what happens, I mean, so the house in Mount Eliza, which is also the other heritage listed one, 2-storey timber, is very West Coast America. So even the use of stone and similar to Geneva, Fritz Geneva. So I think that's very much borrowed from elsewhere. And I think the trip in 1957-58 is where everything else starts to, where Japan comes. I mean, Japan really, I think, transforms his, certainly his relationship between inside and outside. I think there's a real transformation. So there's a material language that starts to play out. It's a strange thing to try and reflect on the Fuchs house because it was so technological on one hand, which I think makes, so when I started looking into Kreisler and his embrace of technology in theatre, you can see that throughout the house. The remote control blinds, the blackout, I mean, you could press a button and literally the house was blacked out. Even the music and the surround sound and all of this, the embrace of technology, but it felt deeply primitive. And it's a hard thing to try and calibrate that, why it felt deeply primitive as a space. Partly it was to do with the way it flowed, but yeah. So I don't know whether that's something that I could say was a new horizon. I feel as if a lot of it came from elsewhere.
Right. Harry,
Do you think they could have gone back though?
Could it have gone back?
I mean, theoretically, they could have returned to Europe.
Yeah, and some of them did. I mean,
Some of them did.
Geneva
went back after.
Yeah, but someone like Romberg, I mean, I think a lot of them had better careers here than they would have in Europe.
Absolutely.
And certainly with Fuchs and that work you've done on the six-pack and actually populating, suburbs with this new model for medium density living. I mean, what chance would he ever have of devising those schemes in Europe as an auteur, as a in an architectural practice. So I think it's a tricky one. I don't know. But
that's the thing.
Can I say, there's a new book that's just come out, which is a great read. Not a Jewish architect, but it's Roger Benjamin's book about the Benjamin House in Canberra, and it's really fantastic. And of course it's Jelinek.
Yep, Alex Jelinek.
Alex Jelinek. It's got crimper bespoke furniture in it, but also what Roger does is he brings everyone in. So Jelinek was partner at the time was Lena Bryans, and so he talks about her Hallenstein sort of heritage, and then he talks about the builder, and then he talks about his own parents and their heritage and the artwork they had there, and then he also talks about how it changed over time and how people, including his mother, changed the interiors. It is just a terrific book about this particular iconic house, but which is, I mean, Melbourne design, but in Canberra, but an émigré who had never designed anything like that. I mean, Alex is a bit of a nutter, really, but, you know, it's extraordinary what he came up with.
Well, on that note, I'm going to do a plug for anyone that is interested in writing about the interior. There's a current call out for fabrications on papers about the idea of the designed interior, but also to continue to watch this space with Austria to the Antipodes. And I'd like to thank very much Alan Pert for his presentation, and Harriet for beaming in from Tasmania. Thank you very much. So thank you very much for tonight.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Harriet.